Good day, everybody. My name is Robert Mikac, assistant professor at Faculty of Political Science, University of Zagreb. Today I will be the moderator. Your Excellency, President of Republike of Estonia, First Lady, Rector of the University, dear guests, all, I wish you welcome to the University of Zagreb. Today we have the privilege to have the dear guests from Estonia here, and today we will have the excellent presentation. First of all, I will call our Rector of the University of Zagreb to give us a first speech. Rector, please.
Your Excellency, President of the Republic of Estonia, Your Excellency, First Lady, Ambassadors, Ministers of Estonia, Vice Rectors, Deans of the University of Zagreb, and dear students as a main thing here. Your Excellency, thank you for coming to the University of Zagreb, the largest and the oldest university of Croatia, but not only in Croatia, it is one of the best universities in the region. And this tradition of almost 350 years means not only that we are part of cultural heritage of Croatia, but also this tradition means quality of teaching and researching. As a research and teaching university as well, we try to improve our excellence and make contacts with many universities around Europe and in the world. So events like that prove that the interest for the University of Zagreb is large, and thank you very much for coming to the university, delivering lectures which will give insights to our students as Europe, as President of European countries, look at the future. So thank you very much again, and I wish you a pleasant stay in Zagreb, and hope once upon a time when you maybe will not be still a president, you can come here to be a professor, guest professor of the University of Zagreb. Thank you very much.
Dear Rector, thank you very much. Our dear guests have a very fruitful career. I will just take some parts of that big and very fruitful career. Thomas Henrik Ilves was born on December 26, 1953 in Stockholm, Sweden. He graduated from Columbia University in New York City in 1976 and received his master's degree of psychology from University of Pennsylvania 1978. From 1993 till 1996, he served in Washington, D.C. as the ambassador of the Republic of Estonia to the United States of America and Canada. From 1996 to 1998, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. From 2002 to 2004, Mr. Ilves was the member of Estonian Parliament. In 2004, he was elected a member of European Parliament, where he was the Vice President of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Ilves was elected President of the Republic of Estonia in 2006 and re-elected for the second term in office in 2011. President Ilves has published many essays and articles in Estonian and English language on numerous topics ranging from Estonian language, history and literature to the global foreign security policy and cybersecurity. Today, he will deliver us the topic, Europea at the crossroads, the way ahead. Your Excellency, please, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I should start by saying this is a very dark day for Europe, and I think we should all stand up and have a moment of remembrance for the people who were killed today. Thank you. It was a dark day because once again Europe was attacked. And today in the heart of Europe in the city that has become second capital for so many of us. And since Croatia joined the European Union, for you too as well. It is absolutely necessary that we view this tragedy as yet another call for all of us to stand up for Europe. We have to do this calmly. Policy cannot be based simply on fear. It is also, again, important for us to remember that when we have so many people escaping terror, that they are not the causes of the terror. They are escaping precisely what attacked Europe today. But we also need to become much more serious about dealing with terror within Europe and in a European context. I think that up till now, we have seen actually fairly little cooperation since we tend to see internal security as an area of national sovereignty. Terrorism, like cybercrime, are things that don't really know borders or boundaries. And so I do hope that the degree of cooperation among law enforcement officials in Europe is dramatically increased. We already see this in the connection between Paris and Brussels. Let us face it, a borderless Europe is also borderless for terrorists. And when we live in that kind of situation, there are different responses. One response, the most obvious one, is to close down national borders, and that I see as a looming threat, is that we go back to having very strong national borders. At the same time, there are other options that make more sense, which would be, for example, dramatically strengthening the external border of the EU and also dramatically increasing the degree of cooperation between national law enforcement agencies is an absolute must. I know from my own time as minister that, in fact, the degree of cooperation between European capitals is rather low, and the amount of time it takes sometimes to identify people is unconscionably long, and this must become a priority for Europe to actually strengthen the cooperation between law enforcement agencies across borders. So I am glad to be in Croatia once again, and I do try to give a lecture when I travel to countries, and so I do that a fair bit. So here in the university in Zagreb, I get to do what I enjoy, which is to talk about things that I like, such as Europe and IT. And I'm glad to be in Croatia again because, in fact, while we are from opposite ends of Europe, given our histories, we actually have quite a bit in common. And forces that have shaped us, everything from Germans who have managed to affect our languages and also our ways of doing things, to the unfortunate experience under authoritarian, totalitarian, communist rule, which again has shaped so many of us in so many ways, and representing a burden from which we are only now coming out from under. Last year, when Croatia celebrated its the 20th anniversary of the Dayton Accords and 25th anniversary of becoming independent with the collapse of the then Yugoslavia, we too this year are celebrating 25 years since the reestablishment of our independence that was destroyed by both Soviet and Nazi occupations. Today, having come out of that bleak past, both Estonia and Croatia find ourselves after much work, as NATO allies, and we're very glad to have Croatia as a NATO ally, and also as fellow European Union members. And we, of course, are always happy to see Croatia as being a model for countries in the region that have yet to come out from, well, I don't know what you want to call it without me getting a diplomatic démarche. So anyway, the countries that have still have not come far enough to become members either of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or of the European Union. And as we know, many of them have a long way to go. Many of them have a long way to go to actually fulfill the requirements of having a democratic form of government. So much remains to be done in our neighborhoods. We too look across our borders, and when we look to the north and to the south, things look pretty good. If we look to the east, then we see that democracy has certainly not triumphed the way that Francis Fukuyama thought we would when he wrote his essay in 1989. We see that, in fact, the hope of liberal democracy that he then had has found not only alternatives, but in fact has become itself a kind of enemy, if we read the kind of statements that were coming out of Moscow these days, well, the last several years. Anyway, just so you know, when I was an ambassador in Washington and I was watching what was going on in this part of the world, and I looked at this kind of messianic, orthodox, authoritarian language coming out of Milosevic, I remember remarking to my colleagues that I really hope that Russia never starts doing and saying the kinds of things that Milosevic is doing. Most importantly, I was most shocked to see Orthodox priests in the early 90s sprinkling holy water on tanks and weapons. Because I thought this is not quite the kind of understanding I had of religion, but anyway, that was being done in Serbia. And just 2 years ago, I saw Orthodox priests in the town of Iveshk, where they produce Kalashnikovs, again, blessing with holy water, things designed to kill people. And once again, when I saw, I guess 2 years ago, when those poor Ukrainians were in their military bases in Crimea before they were forced out, the same thing again with priests blessing tanks. So in many ways, you have seen far earlier what I think all of us in Europe today are seeing, and it makes me worried. I'm sure it makes you worried as well, because this as an alternative to liberal democracy as we know it in Europe, it can be quite frightening. And as we saw both with Milosevic as well as some of the rhetoric that we've seen in the past 2 years regarding Ukraine, and also the decadence of Europe and gay Europa and all these other things that we're hearing from ideologues in Russia, I mean, they're basically, this is the same sentiment. And I think we need also Croatian voices to talk about the dangers of this kind of messianic, anti-liberal, anti-democratic creed. So you have what you think and have experienced and what you see is of vital importance to Europe, and I would encourage you to speak up in those regards. But let's face it, both of us, both Estonia and Croatia have managed to join the European Union at a time when it's kind of a mess. In 2003, which was the year before Estonia joined, along with Poland, Hungary, the Czechs, Latvia, Lithuania, the EU came out with its first security strategy. They never had a security strategy before 2003, and the security strategy began with the following statement: Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free. The violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. Well, that was 2003. In the intervening 13 years, we've seen that, well, the peace is not so strong. The prosperity has suffered dramatically, especially after 2008, 2009. And of course, we are now confronted with kinds of threats that no one really imagined. I should say that we should have imagined some of these threats, perhaps not the authoritarian threats that we see emanating from our east, but certainly I have enough books at home on sort of the imminent crisis of the economic disparity between North and South, and we look at how big the difference in incomes are between our countries, who we tend to think of ourselves not being rich like Germany, but on the other hand, nonetheless, we are rather well off compared to the countries to our south, to the countries in the Middle East, not to mention also some of the countries directly to our east. And so we should have foreseen some of these problems, and the migration crisis, to my mind, is something we should have figured out long, or at least been prepared for long ago. Croatia, of course, has experienced this in a very direct way, having been a transit route for more than 600,000 people in the past year. And I should commend Croatia for doing this in an extremely calm way. And I wish some of our compatriots, where we don't have massive numbers of refugees. In fact, we really don't have, we have hardly any at all in comparison to 600,000. It's something that we should learn from. Well, we do hope that the European Union can come to grips with this crisis. The deal that was done with Turkey last week with the European Council, we hope will work. There's not much evidence yet. On the other hand, things don't get started right away. But returning economic immigrants is a very important part of the deal. And we really have to learn to distinguish between people who are genuinely fleeing the horror of Daesh, ISIL, barrel bombs, and distinguish that from people who are using this as a cover to get to rich Europe. And how we do that will require a huge amount of cooperation between, again, individual nation states, especially when we think that now, as you know better than we, as the Mediterranean area becomes warmer again, there will be more people, again, using the Mediterranean route to travel north. I mean, for a while, in the winter, of course, that's closed, and we see mainly people coming from Turkey, but we know just as well that in the summer months, then people will come from northern Africa across the Mediterranean. Clearly, given the geographic distribution of the source of illegal and also justified flight, that Europe must come to terms with some kind of a functional form of burden sharing, and also a functioning form of burden sharing. This will, again, demand full control of Europe's external borders, but even there, if we want to maintain borderless travel within the European Union, there is no way out unless we start having some kind of burden sharing. You're not in Schengen yet. We are very strong advocates of Croatian membership in Schengen, but at the same time, we have to say Schengen has never been under this kind of threat. I keep reiterating the results of a study recently done by the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany that calculated what would be the cost of the end of Schengen, and they calculate it would be 1.4 trillion euros over a 10-year period. 1.4 trillion over 10 years, that's about $1 trillion over 7 years, and that's €1 trillion is more or less the annual, the 7-year budget of the European Union. So basically, what we're looking at is that if we end Schengen, it's as if there's no more funding from the European Union, because that's how much it'll cost us. That should also give you an idea of how much you stand to gain once you're in Schengen. I mean, not the 1.4 trillion, but nonetheless, the ease of travel and the decrease in bureaucracy is something that is quite substantial. I cannot imagine Estonians today grappling with an absence of Schengen. I don't see how the national budget would be able to grapple with an absence of Schengen. I mean, we do have to put money into our eastern border because that's a very, very un-Schengen country to our east, but to the north and to the south, I mean, I live only 5 kilometers from the Latvian border, so it's just easy to go buy ice cream in Latvia. I don't want to stand in a line anymore. So I would encourage you to keep going. Estonia joined the euro at the height of the economic crisis, and that was quite a task. It was also proof that we believe in the euro. So too, I would argue that I would encourage Croatia to push forward on Schengen, because that once again shows your country's belief in a borderless Europe, which is, of course, an important psychological and political statement. The problem that we also face as a result of the refugee crisis is the exploitation of the crisis by extremist parties and politicians. Parties that we saw during the Euro crisis exploiting the economic crisis, most notably nearby here. But now we see from northern to southern Europe, in my country and in all kinds of other countries, the rise of kinds of extremist parties that we thought had no place in Europe anymore after World War II. And now we see, look at the most recent elections even in Germany, where AfD got considerable seats. We have in my own country, and actually parties almost in every European country, there is some element of support for extremism, and to a degree in which these parties cross the threshold for entrance into parliament. And I did argue last week even that I think there's a bigger fear among politicians in Europe today of parties like that, more even than refugees. Refugees you can handle, but the rise of anti-liberal, anti-democratic parties is much more difficult to handle, and you see all kinds of strange responses from some governments. But the problem is that in an absence of leadership on the part of mainstream politicians, in the absence of decisive action on the part of governments to deal with crisis and rather have bland milquetoast statements and an inability to actually create new policies, that these sort of men of action, sort of like Mussolini was a man of action. I mean, that's how he came to power. We see the same kind of rhetoric, simplistic, sometimes fairly brutal rhetoric, again, finding a place and finding a response on the part of voters. And we have seen that I mean, the same argument I just saw today in my own press, unfortunately, that we cannot accept refugees because they are terrorists. As I said, instead of being people who are fleeing from the same kind of terror. And we've seen that in 11 of last 17 elections in Europe, anti-immigration, right-wing parties have registered an increase in their voting results. So we need to be, I would argue, in Europe, all of us, much more assertive, much more bold, and show our belief in the ability of the European Union to tackle what is a pan-European problem. They're not individual countries' problems. They're problems that affect all of us one way or another. And this, of course, will require resources. Last week, we decided to give 3 billion to Turkey, 3 billion euros. This has to keep in mind that, and we will give 3 billion in the period 2016-2017. Saving Greece in the Eurozone cost 205 billion euros. So let's look at what the relative costs are. 3 billion to assist Turkey to keep migration out, 205 billion euros to keep Greece in the euro, and in many ways, I mean, Turkey's not at fault for the fact that they're right next to Syria and they get all these people coming in. You know, the policies pursued by previous Greek governments, I would say that we have been rather kind to Greece, and we, in fact, in Estonia, helped bail out with real taxpayer money a country whose minimum salary was 10% higher than our average salary, whose pensions are 4 times the size of our pensions, and whose age of going to pension was 15 to 20 years below our pension age. So we help out richer countries. But I think we need to really address this issue financially in terms, address the issue of migrants. Now, to put some kind of additional perspective on the issue of the immigration crisis, we have faced in Europe, probably no one here in this room remembers it, looking at you, I certainly don't, but in the period 1945, 46, 47, there was an organization called the United Nations Refugee Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, UNRWA, as it's better known. You can Google it. If you look at the amount of, well, first of all, if you look at the refugee crisis that Europe faced in the period immediately following World War II, there were 12 million displaced Germans in Germany, another 12 million non-Germans displaced in Germany. Numbers in other European countries were proportionally similar, all with this total mess of the post-war period, immortalized by Thomas Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow, if anyone's read that. In any case, it was complete and utter chaos. UNRWA, if you take the amount of money put into solving the refugee crisis in Europe after World War II during 2 years alone, you look at the 1945 dollar amounts, and you can Google this, you can then calculate what the 1945 dollars are worth in, 2015 euros, and it comes down to basically 50 billion euros were spent primarily by the United States, but also the UK and Canada, to solve the refugee problem in Europe. And the amounts of money, 25 billion euros to Germany at the time, 5 billion to Poland, 5 billion to Italy, 1.5 billion to Austria. I mean, these are considerable sums. So, and again, 50 billion then is equivalent to what governments today, what then had to pay in dollars, but it represents the same value, the same cost to governments. So I think that we need to take a much more dramatic position and not nickel and dime this whole question and then suffer under it. So I think that we need to do this now and to take action, and I call upon all European governments to take a far more serious approach to these issues. At the same time, it's not only the refugee crisis that we're faced with, we have the, what I argue, even though my staff doesn't want me to do it, but the collapse of the post-World War II security arrangements we see with the with what is quite clearly and appropriately called an Anschluss of Crimea 2 years ago, the illegal occupation and annexation of a territory in Crimea. Madam President. I mean, that annexation or Anschluss violates virtually all of the foundations of security in Europe today, beginning with the UN 1945 Charter that forbids the changing of border through military force, reiterated and repeated and signed by ultimately 56 countries with the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. Again, a firm commitment by all signatories not to change borders through use of force or through threat of use of force, and the right of every country to choose its own security alliances. Repeated in the 1990 Paris Charter, once again, no changing of borders through military force, reiterating that every country can choose its own alliances. So it's very bizarre to read post hoc that because Georgia wanted to join NATO, as both President at that time Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin at that time said, well, we invaded them to prevent them from joining NATO, which they said in January 2009 after the 2008 war. And once again, we saw with the Anschluss of Crimea, the same kind of rationale that we don't want Ukraine to join the European Union or NATO. In fact, it's gotten to the point where it's not even joining the European Union, which should be kind of bland enough an idea, but they did it to prevent Ukraine from having an association agreement. I mean, we all know. I mean, you in Croatia and we in Estonia know full well what an association agreement gives you. It's basically a teacher and student exchange program and a little bit of money for agriculture, but that is not joining a big Western organization. So I'm glad, at least in the case of the European Union, we've seen a considerable amount of solidarity, that sanctions remain in force. We will have to continue with sanctions until ultimately until Crimea is returned to where it was. That may take a long time, but basically, if we agree to what has happened, then there is no way we are different from Neville Chamberlain and Munich in 1938. We're functionally equivalent if we allow that to stand. So too in NATO, it's clear with the upcoming Warsaw Summit that we will have to take a much firmer line than we have had. I remember back in 94, 95, was when I was ambassador in Washington, Richard Lugar came out with this article, NATO out of area, out of business, that the idea being that, well, NATO, we have achieved peace in our lifetime, to quote Neville Chamberlain, sort of the Woodstock approach, peace, love, dove, Woodstock is all here and everything's wonderful, and we can all reap our peace dividends and cut back on our defense spending because everyone now has achieved this Fukuyaman liberal dream. Well, here we are 20 years later, and we see Russia resurgent and revisionist, and unless NATO out of area right now seems quite ridiculous. We are, so to revise Lugar's dictum, it's back in area or we're all out of business, not just NATO. So I hope that we get a very strong message of solidarity that we focus on deterrence, not just talking. I mean, dialogue is nice. I have nothing against dialogue, but I'm always amazed how many politicians in especially Western Europe seem to think dialogue is a policy. Dialogue is not a policy. Let's repeat that. Let's all say dialogue is not a policy. Deterrence is a policy. A dialogue is something nice, very nice to have, but deterrence is what we need. And this entails also, from our point of view, a strong forward presence in those areas that are under threat, that feel threatened by Russia's behavior in the region. In our own area, we see constant transponderless military flights, and throughout the Baltic Sea region, it's only a matter of time before we have a real disaster on our hands, because civil aviation does not have radars on their planes. They only can respond. They only know with transponders that say beep beep beep. There's a plane there. If you don't, we already had some real bad near misses. One in which a Russian military plane and a SAS plane leaving Denmark missed each other by a few hundred meters, which if you're going at 800 kilometers an hour, a few hundred meters is just a fraction of a second. So what we want from NATO is that the threats in the east and also the threats in the southern flank be addressed inadequately. I mean, it's just basically time for NATO to understand that it is back in business. Its primary task of territorial defense of its members, of its allies, is the core task of NATO. We don't need to go out of area. We need to defend our area. And here we look towards strong cooperation between those of us with a eastern threat and those of you with a southern threat, sort of understanding each other's problems and concerns and issues so that we address them. Among these, of course, which may not be very popular here in Croatia, but I would say that we really need to spend 2% of GDP on defense. I understand you are spending less now, but I would say please spend more on defense, because you will need it in the future. Not that I want to interfere in your internal affairs, but it is tough. I know how hard it is domestically, politically, because I've been pushing this for years and years, and it's always possible to spend money on nicer, softer, more popular things, and then I get called a warmonger. But on the other hand, now that well, I mean, let's put it this way, it was kind of a no-brainer. People asked me, why did Obama come to Tallinn 2 years ago? Well, there was one reason, because the United States is really worried about countries not spending money on defense, and if you're one of those countries that actually does meet the 2%, well, that becomes kind of a no-brainer as to who to visit before the Wales summit. Now we have the Warsaw summit, probably not completely irrelevant that Poland too is a country that spends 2% of GDP on defense. So if you want to have a summit, you know what it costs. You can also write it off to 2% if you do get a summit. No, I don't think you can. In any case, the last part of what I talk about actually is completely different, because instead of just dealing with ad hoc problems and only dealing with all the stuff that flies into your face, because it just ends up flying in your face, is that we do need a vision for the future in Europe. And clearly the thing that I have spent much of my life doing and promoting, and the last 25 years in Estonia promoting, is IT and e-governance, and getting sort of using IT as a way to modernize one's country. I won't get into it too much, but I do fear for Europe really falling behind in a rapidly changing world. Back in the good old days, before IT, change tended to be linear. Things grew incrementally. But today, As IT moves into everything, and I don't think there's a person in the room without a smartphone, and with all of the possibilities afforded by a smartphone, you have to keep in mind that everything is changing now following Moore's law, which, if you don't know, Moore's law says that the power of a computing chip doubles. Well, it used to be every 1.5 years. Now it's slightly slowing down, but anyway, more or less every 1.5 years, the power of a computing chip is doubled. What does that mean? That means, well, means 1.5 years from now, your smartphone will be twice as powerful as it is today. Now, if you have an entire economy built on progress in IT, this means that those economies that keep up with this will do well, and those economies that do not keep up will do worse. And here, while we may all do wonderful things individually, the problem is that our market size in Estonia, in Croatia, and I would even argue in the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, are too small to really keep up. When we have, in the United States, 330 million of one single market, and then you have a rapidly changing and emerging China. We have in India 1.3 million, where the government has decided to push forward full steam ahead on digitization. And then we have Europe, where we have 550 million and 28 separate markets, where it's very easy to take a bottle of wine from the Algarve in Portugal or here in Zagreb and ship it up and sell it in north of the Arctic Circle in Lapland. It's not a problem. This is what the single market is about. But when it comes to data, when it comes to digits, you can't do that. We have 28 separate markets that actually, with the data transfer across borders after the safe harbor agreement was thrown out by the European Court, has actually gotten even worse, because all data transfer across borders now is up to not a European body, but each national data protection agency. So we're in a situation where Europe stands to become a second-tier player, precisely because we have no digital single market. It comes, the example I always tell, my staff can now go to sleep because I do always tell it, but in any case, 4 years ago I read in a newspaper how this 23-year-old Estonian had just gotten $300,000 for his startup. And since I'm a very pro-STEM tech president, when I see something like that, I invite them in, and we have a cup of tea, and I say, very good. And so I invited this guy in, and he said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm glad you've invited me in, but in 2 weeks I'm moving to the United States. I said, well, why are you doing that? And he said, well, first of all, look at the market size, and besides, look at financing, which I'll get to. Anyway, so 6 months later, he sent me an email saying, I just got 4.6 million for my startup to develop startup money. And then 3 years after he had gotten his initial $300,000, he sold his company for $100 million US. Now that would not have happened in my country. It probably would not have happened in any European country. Maybe Germany, maybe the UK, but not likely. So this is a problem if you don't have a large enough market, and we do not have a single market in digital things today. And that's the flagship of our upcoming presidency, will be to change the legislation in Europe to be able to have a single market in Europe for digital services and goods, what we lack today. The other problem, which is more a matter of culture, which I think is also something we need to address, is the nature of financing. In Europe, 80% of financing is bank-based, and 20% is private equity. In the United States, it's the other way around. 80% is private equity, 20% bank-based. Now, the problem is, I don't know who's ever tried to get a bank loan, but I imagine in 1976, this guy with scruffy beard, long hair, comes into a bank and says, look, I have this idea. I know it's looks kind of funny. It's made out of wood. I call it an apple. I'm 23 and I live in a garage. Would you pay me, could I please borrow $50,000? It's not going to, didn't happen then. It's not going to happen today. Financing must change in Europe because we're not going to be an innovative economy with the current level of financing. We're basically, if you're not at least 40, have gray hair, and have other things, you don't get money from banks. So we have to boost the role of private equity. But anyway, that aside, my point is that unless we have a single market, we will not go anywhere, or we will fall behind, and it will be not only in the following Moore's law that the United States will exponentially pull ahead of us, so too will India, so too will China. I just finished putting together, along with Kaushik Basu, the chief economist of the World Bank, the first ever, believe it or not, but first time in the history of the World Bank figured out that digital might have something to do with development, so we have this big fat book which you can download for free from the World Bank homepage. It's called Digital Dividends, and it represents a huge study of all the benefits that digitization can bring to developed economies. The problem is that many countries in Europe can also be classified as developing economies in this sense because of both the lack of hardware, infrastructure, investment, to the larger issue of transparency and openness that comes with digitization. But the situation is fairly dire, because if you actually look at the 20 largest IT-related or based companies in the world, 14 of them are American, and the rest are Asian. There are no European companies in the top 20 IT companies in the world. That should make us worried. And it does make me worried, and we do need to get the EU moving on reforming itself, because it's very nice when you have the free movement of goods, and that helps us all, and we have free movement of people, and that helps us all. And then we have free movement of capital, which also helps us all. We have, unfortunately, fairly limited free movement of services, but those are the 4 freedoms that are enumerated ultimately in the Treaty of Rome, the 4 freedoms that we all love. I think it's time we need a 5th freedom, and that would be the freedom of movement of data. Because if we don't get free movement of data, which underpins any digital economy, then we're going to fall behind. And this will require a huge amount of work. I mean, why is it that you can't buy an iTunes record for someone in Slovenia? Well, it's because there are 28 different copyright regimes, and there are 28 different regimes for VAT, for credit cards. And so you can if you do buy iTunes records, you can buy them for Croatia, and I can buy them for Estonia, but I can't buy one for Croatia, and you can't buy one to someone in Estonia. This is a fairly ridiculous inhibition on the single market. Anything like that with a physical good would immediately lead to some kind of very nasty reaction from Brussels. So it will require a lot of work. It's estimated that a digital single market could contribute up to 415 billion to the European economy. That means more jobs, more growth, better competition, more investment. So this to me is kind of a no-brainer, and I think we need to go in that direction. So I think that we also do need a positive program, not just worrying about what do we do with the illegal immigration, what do we do with an assertive Russia, what do we do with kind of the messes that are to your east in this area. We also have to have a forward-looking vision of where we want to go to remain, for Europe to remain as something that we all look up to. We do know, of course, that we all know, especially those of us, I mean, if you're from Croatia or Estonia, you know what it's like if you're outside the whole thing, you're all alone and you're a small country. It's not a pleasant picture. We're very happy that we're in the European Union. We're very happy to be in NATO. It is so much in our interest that these organizations function. And so my call to all of us would be to work together in the European Union, in NATO, to keep these organizations functioning, because without them we'd be far worse off. So I'm not going to bore you any longer because I've already been speaking far more than I should have, and I left out a whole bunch. But you get the message. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to have the honor to speak here today. Thank you, and if there are any questions, I can answer them as well. Wow.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It was a very great presentation, and you cover many important topics of modern society, modern Europe. First of all, before we go into the question and answer part, I want to welcome our President, Your Excellency, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović. And also I call our Rector to welcome our President here in University. Rector, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Your Excellency, that you have come. You are at your university and you are at home, so it's not important to greet you anytime, but I need to stress that it is the first time that our President came to the university after elections. She was elected. So thank you very much. I'm very glad that you have come here. And of course, in that opportunity, we can continue, but thank you. And I'm looking forward to come officially next time as in a full, let's say, protocol. Thank you.
Dear Rector, thank you very much. And right now, dear colleagues, dear students, I open the question and answer part. Please, make the questions.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much. My name is Bruno Rukavina. I'm a student here at Faculty of Political Science in Zagreb. And I have a question about cybersecurity. Now, we all know that Estonia is one of the leading countries in the world when we talk about all online transactions, from bank transactions, trade, even, I believe, medical prescriptions are online. And you even have a voting online. Doesn't this lead you to some kind of paradox, I believe? Now, the more sophisticated you are, the more vulnerable you can get. And it is, well, there is a simple example. If there was a nuclear attack, the only creatures in the world that would survive are the cockroaches, because they are the most primitive ones. So if you are the sophisticated one, in the cyber, if you don't depend on internet and communication system, the cyber attack wouldn't have that much effect. So basically, my simple question is, how is cybersecurity today in Estonia after the DDoS cyber attacks in 2007? Thank you.
Well, actually, I use I use the cockroach example myself. And there are countries to this day that wouldn't know if they had a cyber attack. Well, first of all, the DDoS attacks, I mean, that's about as primitive as you can get, because that's just denying access to a server. I mean, that's all it does. It's not getting into anything. I mean, they're dealing with that. We've managed to figure out how to deal with DDoS attacks. Clearly, I mean, cyber makes us far more vulnerable. There are things you cannot really avoid, but that, of course, gets everyone. An electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, would wipe out anything electronic. But short of that, What helps and what prevents the worst cases that we have seen, and we've seen some pretty bad cases in the last year across the world, is that you need a very strong, robust system. First of all, we have to give up on the idea of a single password-based identity. You just can't have a single password. You need a two-factor identity, preferably one which is chip-based one way or another, which is independently authenticated. The situation we have today on the internet is, if you know, Al Gore called it the information highway. So you have this billion-lane wide Autobahn, and no one driving on it has a license plate. So they can do whatever they want. You don't know who did it. In my country, we have a very strong identification system. This is something that the European Union has, with the ADAS directive, is also pushing forward on this, but everyone has an electronic ID. You do have a genuine identity. That's part of it. Part of it is, of course, the architecture of the system. So if you get into one thing, you haven't got into everything. You can only get into you can get at one individual bit of information. The analogy again is, first of all, you have to get into the castle, but once you're in the castle, you can't go to you can get in one room, but you can't go to the next room or the third room. That's an aspect of architecture. If you're really interested, you can learn all about it if you go to www.ria.ee and click the little button where it says ENG, standing for English, because you probably wouldn't understand the Estonian. But there the architecture is described. But you need a strong, robust system. I argue there is no excuse for example, the Office of Personnel Management break-in in the United States last year, in which the personnel record of all U.S. employees were stolen. I mean, it was about as unconscionable as you can get, because the data were there unencrypted, and it was a very weak safeguards there. You shouldn't have that. You shouldn't. The same is true of governments in general, and the same is true of private companies. If you just have a password-based system, you will be hacked. It's just a matter of being disliked or having too much money.
Thank you. Next question, please. Next question, second time. Unique opportunity.
Yeah, it's okay. It's a unique opportunity for me not to have to say anymore. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much in your presentation. Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, we have today unique opportunity to have two presidents in one room. Thank you very much on that you dedicate your time to be with us. And right now I will call our rector to close this great event. Mr. Rector, please.
Madam President, Mr. President, dear guests, thank you very much for being here and giving us the unique opportunity, as our our professor said. University of Zagreb is looking forward to promote European values. And thank you for explaining us what problems and how do you look at that. So it was a great lecture, not only political, but also cultural and moral lecture. That is important. Of course, we will face a lot of problems joining European Union. You told us what we are facing, what we can be afraid of, but our future in the Europe will be good. Thank you for that message. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. And with that, we close this great event. Thank you very much that you are come, and God bless you, and wish you very happy return to your home. Goodbye.